Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Grant Wood in Focus presentation. I'm Julia Jessen, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And today I'm so excited to be talking to you about horses, wagons, and automobiles, Grant Wood, and transportation. This presentation will focus on how Grant Wood approached depicting different methods of transportation in his work and what we can learn from taking a closer look at this detail in some of his artworks. I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to be focusing on works in the collection at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, but also works that are in multiple other collections across the country. To begin with, I wanted to start with a little bit of context for us, thinking about some transportation history, and particularly transportation history in Iowa. So, a little timeline for you and a lot of dates that I'll be mentioning here. In 1819, there was the first steamboat that passed along an Iowa border. In 1838, the first official road in Iowa Territory, which was the route from Keokuk to Iowa City, excuse me. In the 1840s, Cedar Rapids was settled by pioneers attracted to the potential water power and transportation lines offered by the rapids and the river. In 1867, there was the first railroad to traverse the state that was completed, the Union Pacific. And in 1899, the first automobiles were displayed at the Lynn County Fair in Iowa. Still by 1900, just 1 year later, horses were still providing power for most travel. People typically thought in terms of 10-mile trips, and if they wanted to go longer, they would take a train. For trips between town and the farm, for emergencies, or for pleasure riding, people used a buggy or a wagon pulled by horses. In 1908, Henry Ford brought out the Model T, which was an inexpensive, reliable car that was built to run well on country roads and in small towns. In 1920, there was the first commercial air freight flight to Iowa. And by 1922, in that year, Iowa was second, only behind California, in the number of automobiles per person in the state. For every 5 Iowans, there was one car. And even during the Great Depression, automobiles remained in use. By then, cars were considered necessary by those who owned them. Car purchases did decrease, but people repaired their old cars and kept them running during that time. In 1928, we have the first asphalt paved road, and in farming as well. Trucks and large tractors had joined steam engines in the harvest by 1930, and toward the end of the decade, many farmers of eastern Iowa were retiring their teams of draft horses in favor of the light tractors manufactured by several Midwestern firms. So that gives us a sense of the rapid changes taking place during this time and gives us more of an idea of what's going on in transportation within Grant Wood's lifetime and during the period that we're looking at here. So I've organized this presentation to kind of follow the title, Horses, Wagons, and Automobiles. So we'll begin with horses and overmantel decoration from 1930. So before painting American Gothic, Grant Wood enjoyed quite a bit of local success. He was a favorite of Cedar Rapids society, and he painted portraits for his patrons and also counted them among his friends and acquaintances. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Grant Wood would help design and decorate several Cedar Rapids homes. This particular work occupies this interesting in-between space between his studio practice and his work as an interior decorator. It was painted for the Staymates family. Herbert Staymates was a local publisher, and it was going to be hung above their fireplace in the house that they had just built, which is shown in the painting. And it shows too Wood's tendency to kind of fictionalize the scene. So here they're depicted in colonial dress in front of their colonial revival home. And it's a highly stylized depiction of the house and the surrounding landscape. The house was built in 1929. And on the occasion of this painting being donated to the Art Association, we have a photo from George T. Henry where we see the painting hanging above a fireplace, giving us a sense of how it appeared within the home. The caption for this photo is Mrs. Herbert S. Staymates, Stanley Wiederspan, and Van Vechten Schaeffer admire Grant Wood's overmantel decoration in Mrs. Staymates' home. The painting has been donated by Mrs. Staymates to the Art Association's permanent collection and will soon be on display in the Art Center's Herbert S. Staymates Library. Mr. Wiederspan is director of the Art Center, and Mr. Schaefer is chairman of the Art Association's Board of Trustees. So it gives us an interesting look into how it would have appeared within the space for which it was intended. The details are both decorative and charming. We see here in the lower left a robin pulling a worm from the ground, perhaps providing a little indication of industriousness. We see the quaint baby carriage, perhaps referencing family heritage and legacy. The father here greets the family and the setting sun as it slowly sets at the end of the day here, and we see these shadows extending from the trees. The brand new home is somewhat disguised by the ivy that's on it, as well as the fully grown trees that surround it. These also provided a little chance for Wood to explore these different textures and kind of play with their forms as well for these multiple different trees. Our rider on horseback here is on a slender-legged horse that's sort of prancing along on this unpaved road. He's hailing the family, the lady of the house and the two children, as they come out of the house to greet him. And we see that the horse appears to be moving at a pretty fast clop. We've got dust being kicked up by the hooves there along that unpaved road, and the tail of the horse is swinging out kind of sharply behind it. It gives it a sense of the speed that we're seeing from this horse and its rider here. The painting is taking inspiration from several different sources, including illustrations of landmark estates on antique maps of Lynn County, including this one that you see on the left from 1869, Currier and Ives prints, like the one that you see on the right, and willowware china that Wood collected. You're seeing an example in the center. And he would display china like this at his home at 5 Turner Alley. It was also inspired by 18th and 19th century customs of placing a large painted panel above a fireplace. And it also resembles a picture in a 19th century photo album. We see that kind of mat that surrounds the oval-shaped painting, much like what those photo albums would look like. So it's quite a luxurious setting, and that really indicates the prosperity and the growth of Cedar Rapids in the 1920s. We can also think about how it kind of contrasts and compares with another piece that he completed in 1930, American Gothic, of course, on the right there. With American Gothic, we have these rural types that Wood is depicting, in contrast with Overmantel, where it's more so a town scene, downtown Cedar Rapids. And Wood is really aware of that and kind of exploring that tension in the Midwest at this time with this growth of industry and the arrival of modern machinery, mass communication, the growth of wealth and new money during this time as well. And so these are two cultures in Iowa that he's very familiar with, the country culture to which he's been born, and then the city culture to which he's migrated. And he explores both of these in his work. It's not really something that he's interested in as far as condemning either one of those. Instead, he's able to see them with a lot of humor and wit and applies that to both of those different areas. But beyond that, we do see him very frequently reaching back to rural scenes and scenes of the past throughout his artwork. And I think we see that a lot today, too, in the other works that we'll look at, as he's sort of thinking about passing ways of life in the wake of all of this rapid change that's happening. Another piece from around this same time is Stone City, Iowa from 1930. Here he's depicting the area outside of Cedar Rapids that was known for its once thriving limestone quarries. Here you're seeing a photo of that. And it was also the site of Wood's short-lived art colony, a couple years after this painting was created, where he headed a small group of teachers and students for 2 summers in 1932 and 1933. In this painting, we see an open sweep of spacious, rolling countryside. We're positioned at this exaggerated elevation, kind of looking down onto this landscape. And he did look at things from life. There is a certain sense of faithfulness to what he saw around him. And yet it is, of course, highly stylized. It's kind of put through that lens of his own style. And it becomes very kind of storybook-like as well. Here he's using these really clearly defined forms, a lot of kind of flat color throughout. The painting does recede into space. He's incorporating a lot of patterning here too. Gives it a little bit of a sense of kind of the decorative and arts and crafts kind of sense here as well as, again, harkening back to those Currier and Ives prints and the willowware china that he was interested in and that had an impact on his work. This is also a painting where he seems to be really kind of fully working in his new style during this time, post his trip to Germany and his experiences seeing Northern Renaissance painting, as well as Neue Sachlichkeit. And so we see him really leaning into this hard edge style, these kind of smoothed out forms, this kind of new realism in his work. And this is one of the first ones where he's painting within that new style. Throughout this piece, the surfaces are very smooth. They've been cleared of irregularities. Um, we're, again, kind of viewing things from this sort of balcony perspective, up and elevated, somewhat like a stage set in a way, perhaps impacted by his time doing stage design for the Little Theater in Cedar Rapids. In the lower right corner, we've got these farm buildings and trees kind of moving along back to the high bank of the quarry. We've got this road that's kind of winding through the landscape all the way back into the space, kind of leading us through. In the middle area, we've got all of these little buildings that feel kind of toy-like and small, kind of diminutive trees, animals, and figures. The humans are barely discernible. We're kind of closing in here on this little detail. They're dwarfed or obscured by this landscape and all these curves that are occurring throughout. Um, and they feel very kind of still, very kind of solid. Doesn't feel like there's a lot of movement in the piece. And yet we have this single lone figure on horseback riding along on this road. We see them kind of going at what looks like a brisk clop, but doesn't seem to have the same momentum as the previous piece that we looked at. Not quite as hurriedly going somewhere. And so overall, all of these things coming together give this piece a very kind of American folk art quality to it. It brings to mind homemade quilts, as well as that mid-19th century American folk painting, and illustrations of farms and farmland on old Midwestern maps and atlases. In 1930, Stone City would win first prize at the Iowa State Fair in the landscape category. And it was also submitted to the Art Institute of Chicago's annual American Painting and Sculpture exhibition. As we look at this piece, we start to get the sense that perhaps there is this aversion to all of the kind of industry and mechanization that's taking place. And we don't see that reflected so much on the roads and fields of his ideal farmscapes. He kind of stays away from that. And instead, again, like we saw, we have this single lone rider coming along on this road. Another individual writer here in 1931 with The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Here he is drawing inspiration from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's tale of Paul Revere and creating kind of a parody of the fable. There's some satire and wit being portrayed here, but his aim is not to destroy or demythologize the fable, but rather he's interested in kind of preserving it as an element of American folklore. something that he wants to kind of hold on to in his work. So he's reinterpreting the national legend. And at this time, this was something that people in general were very interested in. They were all kind of caught up in this mass enthusiasm for things from early America. This included colonial and federal period history, antiques, and architecture as well. So, what he's portraying here is not meant to be a faithful recreation of any historic scene, but instead it becomes this kind of storybook tale. And it feels very fantastical and kind of childlike in the way that things are represented. Still very much drawing on that kind of American folk art style coming into play in his work. Again, we're in that perspective where we're elevated up above, kind of looking down on this setting. We've got these little buildings and little figures coming out, and it does start to feel kind of like a 3D model, like a mock-up of this landscape. The hero figure here, our Paul Revere figure on horseback, is reduced to a tiny little minuscule man riding along. And interestingly, Wood actually drew inspiration for the horse here from a child's rocking horse and used that as his model for the piece. And I think we can get the sense of that from those widely spread legs as it's kind of rushing along, making us sort of recall and remember a rocking horse in that way as well. The buildings, too, are these colonial buildings, and yet they've been kind of distilled down to their basic shapes, and they feel almost as if they've been made out of children's blocks. So again, paying attention to that kind of storybook-like quality and really leaning into that. It's a very dramatic moment at the same time. We've got a sense of vast space and eerie lighting. The setting, which is Massachusetts, is turned into something that could be Midwestern River Valley, dominated by these high cylindrical bluffs in the background, which seem to look almost like silos or grain elevators. The houses that he's already visited, even those in the village far in the distance in the background there, are aglow with yellow light. There's a lot of light coming from those buildings. And the moonlight highlights that central area. Again, kind of like a stage setting, leaving the rest of it in this great shadow and this kind of darkness all around it. We're moving now into more so vehicles that are drawn by horse. And we'll start here with December Afternoon from 1941. This is one in the series of lithographs that Wood did for the Associated American Artists. These were each printed in editions of 260 and sold for relatively inexpensive prices to people. And it provided Grant Wood with a new creative medium where he was able to kind of stretch his skills in a different way. He would begin these with a well-considered plan in mind, and he would work slowly and methodically, starting with a pencil sketch on heavy brown paper. And then once he was satisfied, he would pick up a wax pencil and begin applying each line to the limestone. He would carefully consider every detail of it, and what each line would do in serving his overall vision for the print. He utilized an old church pulpit to hold the heavy limestone that he was creating the work on, and then it would be sent along for printing to a lithographer. This was actually the last lithograph to be sold through AAA's mail order catalog, December Afternoon, and it was intended to be the final month in Wood's illustrations of the months of the year, of which he only completed 5. So we've got this very nostalgic subject matter, the pleasures of winter being depicted here, rather than the hardships and the kind of tiring qualities of winter as it drags on and on. This was actually used many times as a Christmas card that was issued by Associated American Artists. And here we have kind of a joyful scene of a young man taking the sleigh out for the last ride of the day. We see these long shadows kind of coming from the sleigh and the wall there as well, so we know it's later in the day. And again, we still have that strong relationship to those 19th century Currier and Ives prints that were influencing not only his paintings, but also his prints that he was doing as well. Although the image is showing us this kind of deep winter scene, the lithograph was actually created, the idea for it at least, was created in the summer, August of 1941. So Wood and his secretary and assistant were spending the summer in Clear Lake, Iowa, so that the artist could relax and create. It was one of the hottest afternoons of the year when he made a sketch of the barnyard of the old Boyd place, which included an old sleigh that had been in the yard for many years. And that's the inspiration for the sleigh that we have here, this Portland box cutter sleigh. It is a sleigh and not a farm wagon, so we know work has been set aside for the day. The farmer's preparing to take his waiting family on an enjoyable sleigh ride, or perhaps going on one by himself. There's no real sense of urgency, no need to assume that there's some other dire situation that he's responding to. It appears to be a routine that he and his horse have practiced many times. The horse seems to be well accustomed to this, something that they anticipate and enjoy during this time. There is a little bit of a question here about the footprints. And what exactly is going on there? So there are footprints carefully placed in the snow, but they seem to indicate that the farmer has somehow walked beneath the sleigh. There's a lack of fresh tracks for the sleigh itself, and the snow has actually drifted over the sleigh on the runners, which would indicate that it's been standing where it is for some time. And so it's kind of a confusing question of why we have those footprints going there. And perhaps that was an indication of Wood's humor. Perhaps he's showing this very idyllic scene, but also giving a little hint that it's not quite exactly real, that it perhaps is too good to be true. We don't really know. But again, here it feels that he is seeking to preserve this rural way of life. The image feels very optimistic and hopeful as well. So he's hearkening to those things through the use of these elements. Higley's Block from 1926. This is one of a series of drawings that Wood did during this time that are inspired by Luther Brewer's book, The History of Lynn County, which was published in 1911. And it dealt with the pioneer background of Iowa as exemplified by Cedar Rapids. And this is definitely something that Wood would have been interested in. He often was thinking about those pioneer origins of, or as what he saw as the pioneer origins of the state. And he would make reference to that in some of his other works as well. This series was actually created for the Turners, and he had previously made drawings of the new location of the Turner mortuary that they had used for advertising purposes to promote the opening of the business. So they were a series that were showing the interior and exterior of the mansion that they were using as the mortuary. Those were published in booklet form in December of 1924. And these seem to have been used somewhat similarly, this particular series. Looking at an ad from the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette from November 18th, 1926, there's another very similar kind of image here, not the exact same one or one that's in our collection, but we can tell that there are some similarities, that little banner kind of giving us an indication, as well as at the bottom of the ad, it says that it's one of a series of sketches by Grant Wood depicting pioneer scenes of Cedar Rapids and vicinity. So it seems that this too was part of this series and perhaps was also used by the Turners as kind of an advertisement for their business. The ad itself connects that kind of pioneering spirit of the town's origin to contemporary business interests of the day and uses, the Turner mortuary as kind of the exemplification of that. So the ad reads, quote, "The event pictured here, which occurred about 1840, was the first sale of goods to be made in Cedar Rapids. No regular store existed until 1844, when Joseph Green put in a stock of goods and with two brothers carried on an extensive and prosperous business for many years. From this humble beginning have grown the vast mercantile interests which serve Cedar Rapids today." End quote. The image represents a real location in Cedar Rapids, Higley's Block, and references real people and businesses. in this very kind of charming pen and ink drawing. A horse-drawn carriage or buggy rolls out of the picture plane. You're seeing that here, as well as some little figures behind, a man tipping his cap to some ladies walking along, and another man getting his shoes shined. We also have a single seat horse-drawn vehicle here kind of rounding the corner. And altogether, it feels like he's highlighting sort of this earlier era, while also connecting it to the present day, thinking about these earlier commercial interests and showing the sort of legacy, history, and tradition of those interests occurring in Cedar Rapids. From the same series, we have the old fire engine from 1926. This is depicting an 1886 steam-powered fire engine pulled by horses. We can tell that this vehicle seems to be moving fast with a horse in running position, legs stretched out, kind of like what we saw with Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Seems to be moving very fast. And the wheels as well are spinning quickly. We've got those lines that are indicating movement there. So we get the sense that they're on their way to an emergency right now, and moving quite quickly. So another example of kind of reaching into the past and showing something from this era that was also discussed in the book that he's referencing here too. Moving on to Arbor Day from 1932. Here we're seeing a scene of the late 19th century on Arbor Day in spring, where a teacher and her students are planting a tree outside of their one-room country schoolhouse. Wood actually painted the commission for the Cedar Rapids School Board as a memorial to two school teachers, one of whom was known to have planted a beautiful grove of trees, one each year on Arbor Day, at the country schoolhouse where she had taught before coming to Cedar Rapids. Wood did visit the teacher's former school, and he also studied other rural schoolhouses around Cedar Rapids and also drew on his own memories as well. However, typical for him, he didn't paint the rural schoolhouse as it appeared in the 1930s, surrounded by a grove of fully grown trees. Instead, he looked back to the 1890s, when it kind of stood out and there wasn't a lot surrounding it. There is kind of this barren landscape around it, and it sort of stands out as the only building in near view here. We do see in the far distance some little buildings that are populating the space. We also have our group of people here in the schoolyard, and they feel almost like toys. Again, that sense of kind of a storybook quality comes through here too. There isn't a lot of detail or definition in the faces here, and so they feel kind of anonymous, like a child's toys. Here as well, we have again that perspective where we're kind of elevated up, looking down onto the scene, that sort of balcony view. There is this dugout road in the landscape there, and it sets apart that schoolyard, again, almost like a stage. We've got more light in that area as well, which focuses our attention there. And gives it a sense of kind of importance, makes it feel very dignified as we're looking at this tree planting. This piece also showed Wood's interest in depicting the things that he saw as being kind of swallowed up by modern civilization, by all of this progress and changes that were happening. So the dirt roads that were leading to the one-room schoolhouse, the arrival of students by foot and by horse-pulled wagon, as you're seeing there on the left. I've also seen that referred to as a farmer stopping and kind of saying hello on his way. The hand pump for water, the shed for storing logs as well, for wood burning, and the outhouse with its crescent moon on the door. So in Arbor Day, he's showing kind of a lot of things all at once. He's got the fields and the farmer plowing in the background, kind of linking itself to the establishing of the land. And again, those kind of pioneer origins that he often thought about. In the middle ground with the schoolyard, we've got this next generation starting this community. And then with the tree, this idea of looking to the future and what that will look like. So again, quite a hopeful image, but very much drawing on the past and kind of highlighting that in the work. Another lithograph, this one from 1937, Seed Time and Harvest. This is one of Wood's first lithographic prints. In a newspaper article, he explained that the inspiration for this piece came from an actual barn that he saw, draped with strings of seed corn. He was struck by the beauty of the patterns that the strings of corn made against the gable of the barn. And this was a barn that he actually saw between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, although, of course, he altered the scene considerably and again kind of put it through that lens of his style and made it into a Grant Wood. Here we have a farmer working in isolation, storing his bountiful fall corn crop while selecting the finest ears to be hung to dry in preparation for the spring planting. We've got that makeshift ladder on the left leaning against the shed, something that appears to be handmade, showing again the resourcefulness of the farmer here, his own self-reliance. He's here by himself doing all of this. We get a sense of the weight of the bushel as he kind of leans back to balance that weight that he's carrying. And the wooden wagon, too, that we've got here. It also reflects the artist's personal experiences on the farm, and he's depicting it quite accurately. This is a special harvesting wagon that's built with one side higher than the other. That side, the bang board, enabled the farmers walking alongside the horse-drawn wagon to toss the ears of corn in without worry of overshooting and wasting the crop. Sometimes it was called a bank board or a backboard, but that idea of a bang board got its name from the noise that the ears of corn would make when striking those wooden planks. Eventually, this would be replaced by tractors, mechanical corn pickers, things like that. But for Wood, that wasn't something that he really introduced into his farmscapes. That evidence of the industrial age wasn't really something that he was interested in depicting. And so motorized farm machinery remains pretty absent in his interpretations of farming. Another of the lithos, March from 1941, which is often considered to be one of his greatest prints. And it does give a good idea of his working method of dividing the picture plane into thirds to create a really dynamic composition. So he would actually divide this into 9 equal quadrants using 3 vertical lines and 3 horizontal lines. And then he would take intersecting diagonals and he would place the most important features of the work on those diagonal lines. And so here we see this resulting composition where it feels quite abstract, this landscape, quite minimalist in a way with these barren fields surrounding this farmhouse. And we get the sense of kind of a harsh weather landscape. The winter wind is kind of harsh and tedious during this time where winter is still hanging on just a little bit. The viewer is placed kind of low down, looking up at the road from the bottom of the hill, which also gives a sense of perhaps helplessness as they're looking upward. That road is slashing in a Z formation, and a single tree is bending in harmony with the farmhouse. The farmhouse, too, seems to almost lean that direction as well, pointing toward our little miniature horse and wagon with the farmer there in our wagon as they're trying to kind of make it home in the face of this oncoming storm. We've got sunlight on this central section of road, really drawing our eye to that area and moving us through. And he continues to draw our gaze to the farmer and to the horse-drawn wagon through that and through their placement within the picture plane. Not only is the wind depicted as being so strong that the trees and the fence posts and the house and the barn are all leaning very precariously to the right, the road itself, too, with that sharp zigzag, seems almost as if it has been pulled in that direction. And here, too, again, we see no evidence in the background of any villages or towns in the distance, no smokestacks, nothing like that, that would indicate industry, even in the far off distance. And no engine driven machinery here, just miles of this kind of empty gravel road in and out of the countryside as we kind of go along these zigzagging roads. Moving into the town for a rare kind of industrial painting here, the old J.G. Cherry plant from 1925. Now we're thinking about trains as we're looking at the next couple of pieces. So shortly after becoming a full-time artist, he needed income and was taking on commissions from a lot of local businesses during this time period. And the J.G. Cherry Company was one of them. They were a dairy equipment business in Cedar Rapids, and the paintings that he created for them were intended as a form of advertisement for the plant and for their new equipment. So he did a series of portraits highlighting factory workers on the job, showing the creativity of labor, as well as the industry's contribution to the local economy. And the only non-portrait painting in the series is this one here, where you're seeing the building from the exterior. The Gazette remarked in 1925 about this piece, quote, "To the painting of the factory exterior, Mr. Wood has lent the effect of sincerity by much detail, including even the telephone poles and the junkyard, avoiding the tendency to doll up with flowers and bordered lawns, sometimes seen in the purely commercial artwork," end quote. The buildings on the right were built in 1919 for the Cherry Burrell Company, and two other buildings on the left, located across the 4th Street Railroad tracks, were built earlier in about 1910. Across the middle of the painting is a pedestrian walkway built across the tracks to connect the complex of buildings together. The J.G. Cherry Company Commission demonstrates Wood's close relationship with the businesses in Cedar Rapids area and how they helped to contribute to his success. Many local proprietors would continue to be patrons of Wood's art throughout his career. And it's really the support of these local businessmen that was crucial to the blossoming of his career during this time. And we have, of course, in the center, our train coming into the scene, kind of further enlivening it, and perhaps gives an indication of that continual progress of industry and connects it to the company that he's representing here as well. This is one of the very few, perhaps the only industrial scene that was ever painted by Wood. And I think that train really plays a crucial role here in thinking about industry as it's represented within this image of this company. Um, an earlier work, or actually this is 1 year later, excuse me, from 1926, Old Steam Motor. This is also part of that series that he did for the Turners that were used, we think, possibly for advertising for their business. This is Old Steam Motor. And here we can think about by 1880, steam cars were reported in service to the Cedar Rapids, Marion area. And there was also the Cedar Rapids and Missouri River Railroad that ran from Cedar Rapids to Council Bluffs. So here you see these cars here with our little figures that are kind of poking out, looking out. And if we think about how it relates to the previous piece, we see these two kind of very different landscapes. One in which there's kind of this industrial boom, and then this one in which you're looking backwards and kind of showing some of the origins of that. Much more barren of a landscape, but still that industry progress is coming in. So kind of giving an indication of that, but from this earlier time period. Now we'll move into thinking about automobiles, although not directly, at least with this first piece. These are tram posters of Vernon Heights. This is from a time in the late 1910s when Wood was taking a job designing promotional brochures and advertisements for the local developer Henry Ely and constructing dollhouse-sized models of Ely's homes. He would actually mold newspapers and sponges into the shapes of shrubbery and trees to resemble landscaping. And these commissions that he did for Ely um, were intended to kind of show off the houses that he was developing. And one of these areas in which he was developing was the Vernon Heights neighborhood. So, as part of this, Wood is credited for creating these tram posters or trolley cards that he designed in collaboration with Ely for the promotion of Vernon Heights. Um, so as we're looking at them, we see we've got these sort of perfect expanses of road. There's a detail. These kind of perfect boulevards with these lovely little tree-lined streets, something that feels very sort of perfect and lovely. And yet there's no vehicles pictured at all. And they were created again for promotion in trams, so public transportation. So thinking of kind of the dissonance there between showing something on public transportation that depicts no transportation at all within this community, kind of a perfect area where no one would be bothered. And they also included these poems that would emphasize the kind of residence one could find in this peaceful suburb. So in this case, I'm showing them to you for the lack of vehicle that is included within these tram posters. Another early work that I wanted to show is this Paris street scene with green bus from 1926. And this is kind of unusual for Wood in his European scenes, in his Parisian scenes, because typically when he would go out to the squares and parks of Paris, he would depict kind of quiet experiences there. He didn't often show modern traffic in those areas. He would maybe include a few small figures who were strolling along or occasionally kind of pausing in an open foreground in one of his depictions. But here we see something that feels a little bit more lively, a little more commonplace, more so the everyday. So we've got this green bus and a bunch of figures kind of crowding around, perhaps waiting to board. And this is very much during the period where he's working still in Impressionism. And here using kind of a more robust technique where he's scraping in the area of the grassless circular square there in the center. And then that continues upward through this tree, which almost seems to encompass the building behind it, kind of merging the two together. So a very interesting kind of unusual depiction for Wood, particularly in these Paris scenes. And then, of course, sort of the most obvious representation of automobiles in Wood's artwork is Death on Ridge Road from 1935. And from it, we get that it is a very kind of sober assessment of, modern society and its impact on country living in this image. So we have the bright red truck cresting the hill, coming upon a sleek limousine or sedan, passing this slower Ford car in the other lane. The black limousine stretches out to regain the right side of the road after illegally passing the slower car, and the oncoming red truck is driving over the hilltop, and we get the sense of this kind of impending doom, that there will undoubtedly be a crash here, some sort of disaster that's going to happen. The vehicles are traveling on a steeply pitched and curving ridge road. This was actually a passageway that settlers had originally carved out along high ridges to cross the territory by wagon. And it was once rough and muddy, but now, as depicted in this image, it's paved to accommodate car travel and then lined with fences to keep intruders from the fields and animals from the road. It's a hard asphalt finish. And here we see this conflict between these two different things, the kind of the modern and then this rural society off to the sides with the fields. We've got a contorted space, this very kind of dramatic sense of space, deep shadow and flashing light, the impending storm in the background as well. All of it adds to this sense of foreboding and this idea of doom that's oncoming here. Time is standing still in this moment, and yet at the same time, we also get the sense of the speed of this car as it's kind of almost seeming to fishtail around the other car. and attempting to get back into the right lane. That speeding car feels sort of out of place in this country landscape. And in a way, so does the truck. The truck is a sign of modern commerce as well. And we also have those telephone lines that seem to kind of protrude into the space, also indicating the advancement of new technologies within this rural landscape as well. And from all of this, we get the sense that Wood never really reconciles himself to the automobile age. He seems to have distrusted cars and avoided driving as much as possible. And some of this may be due to an accident that took place in the year prior to this painting being created. It was actually on a ridge road north of Stone City, Iowa. And the accident left his poet friend, J. Sigmund, seriously injured. So that also could have contributed to his approach to this work. He was also feeling a lot of anxiety with his mother's death that he felt was kind of soon impending. And so that may have also contributed to this as well. Here we're seeing this contrast between that fast-moving modern world clashing with that of the slower pace, simpler way of life in this rural area. And that rural world is represented not only by the landscape, but also by the slow-moving Ford car. Um, it was a car that was often used by farmers, plain, sturdy, and we see it being overtaken by this more kind of aerodynamically sleek and streamlined sedan, a symbol for a more fast-paced, kind of sophisticated style of modern living. So here we've got this disparity between the modern machinery and the natural landscape, the storm brewing in the skies, and those telephone poles that become almost like funeral crosses, all give us the impression of um, kind of a gloomy, not optimistic outlook on the impact of that kind of modern life on this Midwestern landscape. A few years later, he would create this piece, New Road. Um, this was a landscape painting of the new gravel road to Solon, just south of Cedar Rapids. And in this piece, he excludes any signs of automobiles. And cars were actually why the graded curve and the intersection at the bottom of the hill had been expressly created. So in this case, he removes them completely and focuses only on the landscape itself. So another instance of showing something that relates to cars, but removing them completely. And then I have two kind of outliers to finish up with here. This is Return of Columbus from America. This is an early work from Wood, from his younger days, from his childhood. This is from 1904. And this illustrates an unusual event in history, the return of Christopher Columbus to Spain from America on March 15th, 1493. And it was a type of scene and this kind of focus on Columbus and showing the ships at sea. This was something that was being done in 20th century American art, but we actually think we may know the source for this particular watercolor from Wood. It seems that he maybe copied the cover illustration for a magazine called The Youth's Companion, and its issue from March 17th, 1904. The journal was known for its patriotic content. The Pledge of Allegiance was not only invented by one of the magazine's staff members, Francis Bellamy, it was first published in the magazine in 1892 on the 400th anniversary of Columbus. And that kind of Columbus mania would continue on for several years, and no doubt would also influence the young Grant Wood as well. So all three of Columbus's ships are visible in Wood's watercolor, the largest taking up most of the upper half of the painting. The bottom half is taken up by the swirling waters of the Atlantic. As a whole, this watercolor represents an unusual subject matter to which Wood never returned, but it does show an early interest in these kind of myths of great men and this idea of Columbus as a so-called discoverer of America. And we see that kind of exploration of myth and fable as something that he explores later on in Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which we saw earlier, as well as other work by him too. It's not overtly impressionistic, but we can see some of the precursors of the loose brushwork that would characterize his style in the 1910s and 1920s. Clearly, the choice of transportation here is based in history and on his source material. And in this case, it's also serving as a chance for him to replicate other artists and hone his skills as well. And then finally, with some airplanes here. So Blitzkrieg, or Bundles for Britain, Horrors of War from 1940. Wood was a staunch supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, and he endorsed the president's pro-British policy. As World War II approached, he momentarily interrupted his personal engrossment in isolated American themes with a few minor political drawings in reaction to the Nazi invasion in Europe. He developed only one of these drawings into a finished picture for public viewing, which is the one that we see here. And this was to aid the Bundles for Britain campaign, which was a US relief organization sending clothing and medical supplies to England. So here we're seeing a melodramatic war scene for a poster emblazoned with this legend of Blitzkrieg and featuring a young mother sheltering her little boy while the RAF counterattacks German bombers. As we're looking at the planes, we see that they're angled in such a way to both make the scene more dramatic, to kind of add to that heightened sense of melodrama that's present here, but also to show the symbols emblazoned on their side so we can kind of see and somewhat understand what's going on in the skies above our figures here. So to wrap things up here, we've looked at a lot of different works today, showing a lot of different types of transportation, and Wood seems to have continually returned to that idea that many of his subjects were on the verge of extinction as modern society and new technologies came in, and perhaps he felt some worry that those 19th century foundations of Midwestern farms and small town culture that he appreciated so much would be forgotten or would be gone. And so he often kind of looked back to them and represented them in his work. And of course, that sort of feeling impacts his portrayal of transportation. And throughout, we end up seeing little evidence of signs of technological and mechanical progress through his work. And instead, we see him looking backward very often. And when he does look forward or does show kind of the contemporary moment, it sometimes is in a more foreboding way, in a way that shows something is more doomed in that way, like we saw with Death on Ridge Road. So this has been a lot of different methods of transportation. I hope that this deep dive into this aspect of Grant Wood's life and career was interesting for you, maybe gave you something new to think about in this minutia of looking at Grant Wood's work. I hope that you will join us again for future Grant Wood in Focus presentations and any of our other presentations as well. Do check out our YouTube channel where you can find all of these recorded and able to be watched whenever you would like. So thank you again so much for joining me, and I hope you join us again. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.